I'm Joel Bokenfohr, FCC Farm Transition Specialist, and I'm here with Managing Partner Jeremy Herbert from Felesky Flynn. Today we're going to talk a little bit about trusts, when they make sense, when they don't make sense, and if there's a potential fit for your farm operation. So I guess as we kind of jump right into things, kind of in simple terms, what is a trust, I guess, as a farm looks to consider it?
So a trust is basically a legal relationship. It's a relationship between three people. One person who sets up the trust, which is called the settlor, one person who administers the trust, which is called the trustee, and then the trustee administers the trust for the benefit of a different person, and that person's called the beneficiary. And so what happens is the property that's in the trust gets managed by the trustee for the benefit of the beneficiaries.
Trusts are something we see a little bit more done in the corporate world or for larger scale businesses, and you see a little bit in the farm sector. Do you have any kind of comments around the difference between the two of what people would need to think about?
So in the non-farm context, typically where trusts become very valuable is situations where you've got a company that's growing in value and people are trying to manage the tax that they might have to pay on the last to die of them and their spouse. In the farm context, it's a little bit different in that there is the ability under the Income Tax Act to transfer some assets to your kids on a tax-deferred basis, whether it's shares of a company or land directly.
And those would be the intergenerational rollover rules, right?
That's right. There's some intergenerational rollover rules, and also there's some rollover rules that apply when somebody's passed away. But because of those rules, there isn't this tax owing when the last of mom and dad pass away that needs to be managed. So there is some opportunities there to avoid the trust and just have the property go directly to the children, provided that you know who you want to have those assets. The trust does provide more flexibility in terms of deferring who actually gets those assets to somewhere later down the road, but needs to be managed in the farm context with these rollover rules that we just mentioned.
What do you see really appeals to farms about holding things in a trust?
Both in the farm context and in the non-farm context, the real advantage of the trust is that you maintain control over the assets, even though you're controlling them as the trustee for somebody else. So you get to maintain control of the assets, but you have to conduct yourself for the benefit of the people who the assets are to go to. And it really buys you a window of time where you still get to maintain control of those assets without determining finally who's going to get them at the end of the day.
Are there some considerations in our timeline that we really need to think about?
So there's always a few interesting rules, so it's hard to make a generalization, but the big rule for most trusts is they typically have, for tax purposes, a 21-year life. So this idea that you can have an option on determining who should get what out of the trust really has a time to run of 21 years. After that time, there's either going to be tax that will be owing on the assets, or more commonly, the trustee will distribute the assets out to the beneficiaries.
And so if I'm a family and we're kind of looking at this a little bit, what are kind of some different things that we really need to think about from the family and the tax perspective?
There's certainly a tax component to the trusts and some opportunities to use the trust to get a favorable tax result. But the trusts are also a very powerful tool just in general estate planning to make sure that the assets go to the individuals that the parents want them to go to at the right time. This idea that the trust can last for 21 years does provide mom and dad with a little bit of an opportunity to have a period of time where those assets are to be for the benefit of the children, but they don't have to actually give ownership of the property to the children directly, possibly because they're too young or possibly because they have a disability or some other reason why the family thinks it's important for mom and dad to maintain control of them in the short term.
Anything that you see commonly where it really doesn't make sense for the farm to take it into account, where we'd want to maybe have a farm consider other options?
Times when they don't make sense is there are some special rules for farm property where they can be transferred on a rollover basis to, say, a child. And so in cases where that's available, the trust, sometimes the advantages of the trust are less prominent in that situation because you can rely on these other rules in the Income Tax Act to get favorable transfers of property to, say, a child for farmland or shares of a farm corporation. Where trusts can be more beneficial is in situations where maybe those special rules for a rollover of a farm property aren't available, and we're looking for other techniques to use to get a beneficial tax result in the context of our estate plan.
What would be kind of your key takeaway as an advisor for farms that are maybe looking at trust as an option or a vehicle for them in their estate plan?
A trust can be a very powerful estate planning tool, but it is one tool in the toolbox. It's not going to solve all the family problems. The ability to maintain control over some assets for the benefit of somebody else for a period of time can be super beneficial to the family, but it isn't the be all and end all. And so they have to be careful to make sure that they've got a plan that encompasses what the trust can do and what the trust can't do.
So it kind of sets a decision-making point in time. I guess, are there other family considerations when they're going into it? You know, maybe mom and dad are trying to rule from the grave. What would you kind of quiz them on a little bit?
the idea that you can rule from the grave can be a bit problematic in terms of if you set something up that is not easy to administer, then it can be costly because people will have different views on what exactly the individual that set up the structure was looking to accomplish. There is this sense that you want to control things, but at some point practically that becomes very difficult to do and just increases the likelihood of litigation, which usually is what people are trying to avoid when they set up these structures in the first place.
Who should a farm kind of go to see to make sure they get proper advice kind of on these plans?
So a trust is a legal document, and they are widely varied in terms of what's in the trust. So a lawyer needs to draft the trust for you, and using a precedent trust, while sometimes can be helpful to start, it really needs to be dealt with by the individuals to make sure that the trust actually says what the individual setting up the trust want it to say, because those rules will govern what the trustee can do and who they will be providing that benefit to. And so you really do need some professional advice to set it up. It's not something that can just be taken off the shelf and recycled from somebody else's use.
Jeremy, really appreciate the information. Thank you so much for joining us today and kind of walking us through the ins and outs of trusts.
Thanks, Joel. Happy to be here.
For many of you, you've asked a lot about trusts, and if this is something that makes sense for you on your farm, sort of your next steps, please consult with proper accounting, legal advice to make sure it's the right tip for you, and they can kind of walk you through different scenarios and options for your plan.